to the Center for American Progress and our afternoon's program on U.S. strategy in the Middle East. I'm Rudy deLeon, a senior fellow here at the center. Today, CAP releases a major report, Leveraging U.S. Power in the Middle East, a blueprint for strengthening regional partnerships, written by the Center's Middle East team, led by senior fellow Brian Katulis. The report is available online, as well as a number of copies at the back desk. It is available on the web. To quote from the report, events and trends in the Middle East, from the rise of the Islamic State to the refugee crisis spilling into Europe, demonstrate that the United States has important stakes in what happens in that region. Given the civil wars and counterterrorism challenges in the region, the next administration could find itself stuck in a cycle of reaction without a set of clear long-term strategic priorities to guide it. Going forward, the United States should shift away from a crisis management paradigm toward one of renewed American leadership in the region that seeks to more effectively integrate its stepped-up military engagement with diplomatic and economic engagement. The problems of the region require a long-term approach, and policy planning should shift toward working with partners to outline an affirmative agenda for the next decade to look to what can be done, not simply in one administration. The Center for American Progress is honored to host General Joseph Votel, Commander, U.S. Central Command, for a discussion on the current and future challenges and opportunities for U.S. strategy in the Middle East. Our distinguished guest will offer his regional assessment on the current security challenges and examine long-term trends. Among his many assignments, the General directed U.S. efforts to counter the use of IEDs, independent explosive devices, a key threat to U.S. and allied forces. He has served as Deputy Commander Operations for the 82nd Airborne in Afghanistan. He has subsequently been assigned to be Deputy and then Commander of the Joint Special Operations Command at Fort Bragg, Commander of U.S. Special Operations, and now his current assignment as Commander, U.S. Central Command. The conversation with General Votel will include our taking questions from our audience here at the center. Following the general remarks, we'll have a brief break, but then there will be a panel discussion on perspectives toward the Middle East to be moderated by our CAP Vice President for National Security, Vikram Singh. The panelists will include Derek Chollet, Counselor and Senior Advisor for Security and Defense Policy at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and author of the book, The Long Game, How Obama Defied Washington and Redefined America's Role in the World. Linda Robinson, a Senior International Policy Analyst at RAND, with a research focus on the U.S. strategy to counter the Islamic State, gray zone conflicts, building partner capacity, and building special operation forces. And Michael Singh, the Lane Swig Senior Fellow and Managing Director at the Washington Institute and a former Senior Director for Middle East Affairs at the National Security Council, as well as a Special Assistant to former Secretaries of State Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell. And of course, our Senior CAP Fellow, Brian Katulis. As our report notes, bad news from the region too often obscures opportunities for progress. Despite its current problems, the Middle East can draw on important developments and potential assets, including youthful populations working for positive social change and the fact that some countries in the region are taking steps to change outdated political and economic modes. These assets represent a silver lining in an otherwise gloomy regional picture. Yet the Middle East will need target engagement from the United States to make good on this potential. So I thank you for being here in attendance, and I thank General Votel, who has one of the most challenging assignments for those who wear the uniform and serve in the armed services of the United States. Has a tremendously challenging assignment, but He is well prepared for that, and we look forward to our discussion that is about to occur. So, General, welcome to the Center for American Progress. Thank you very much. So, General, welcome. And these are challenging times. Our main focus here today is to really look at the region more strategically. But I think what's on many minds is, of course, the actions and the engagement now going on near Mosul. And I wonder if you might just give us a few perspectives on that as we get started.
Sure, thanks. And Secretary, let me thank you for the invitation to be here today. General Mattis, who we discussed a little bit ago, encouraged me to come here, and when he gives advice, I generally take it there. I have deep respect for him. So thank you very much, and thanks for the work of the center here and what you all do, contributing to our intellectual capital and investment out there. So as everybody is aware here, earlier this week on Monday, the long-awaited operation towards the liberation of Mosul started. What I can report to you here, I think, is that it is on track. We are on track with the plan. In some areas, we are right where we expected to be. In a couple areas, we are a little bit ahead of where we expected to be. We have operations really coming at the city from 3 different directions: the south, the east, and the north. In the northeast, and I think what we're seeing so far is that the plan that the Iraqi security forces have put together, along with their Kurdish partners in Kurdistan, is meeting the needs of what they need to do right now. I would caution to you, it's very early on. We're here on day 2 or day 3 of the operation itself, so it certainly will be a difficult operation, and the Islamic State has certainly had a long time to prepare for this operation. But I think it's noteworthy that we are at this phase. And as I talk to the commanders forward and for my own personal visits, there's certainly been a lot of work done between the government of Iraq and the Kurdish regional government, President Barzani and his Peshmerga forces, to make sure that we had as well of a coordinated military operation as we can, and I think you're beginning to see some of that unfold here. I think it's a little early here to talk about timelines and stuff like that, but I think we're on track with where we need to be right now.
Okay, well, thank you for that. One of the questions, and I think the report that Brian Katulis and the Middle East team issued today looks at a region which now has many interests and multiple focus. Iran to the east, Egypt and its economic reforms to the west, with the Gulf states really setting a new model for their own engagement in the region. To watch, my first trip to the region was 1987 in the middle of the Iran-Iraq War. And to note the changes in the Gulf states in particular in terms of their own engagement in the region, but also they're building their own partner capacity to focus on the security issues. But when you look at the broad issue that constitutes Central Command, it's really the Middle East to Central Asia to Afghanistan and Pakistan. What are the issues on the horizon that we need to be more focused on in the coming years?
Well, I think one of the issues we need to be focused on is what's the long-term role of the United States in this particular region, and how do we work that with our partners, the partners that are emerging, and certainly the long-term partners that we've had in the region, and how do we begin to think about what our role should be? As you correctly identify, we do have some very capable partners in the region that are able to do expeditionary operations, have been very receptive of the relationship and the training and other things we've done. And so I think one of the first things we have to do is understand what our role needs to be in the region as we move forward, and I think that will be something we will continue to do as we move forward. There's certainly a lot of challenges, as you highlight here. I mean, there's civil war, there's terrorism, there's Sunni Shia issues in the area. There is the role of Iran and some of their activities across the region, and how we begin to address that. So I think from my perspective, as I've kind of stepped in this job, as I've highlighted to many of our partners we've talked about, I've really tried to really focus on three things as I've kind of, just in the last 6 months that I've been in this job. One is listening to what our partners are telling us, and making sure we have a good understanding of their perspective on things. Second of all has been to reinforce relationships. We have partners in the region who we have had long-standing security relationships with, and who we've been extraordinarily dependent on, and we have to continue to reinforce those relationships and adapt them as they grow and change. But we've got to make sure that we strengthen all of our relationships in the area. And then second of all, third, I think we have to be responsive to our partners out there. I'm particularly concerned about this, whether it's things like foreign military sales or responses to the things they're asking us to. I think we have to be responsive. I think they expect us to be responsive, and that doesn't necessarily always mean saying yes. It means being able to let them know where we are on things. And so those things right there, as I've kind of started to get my arms around this position and traveled more deeply even than I previously had in the region, are the things that I've been thinking about.
Thanks for that. One of the main themes of the report is to look for ways where we can strengthen cooperation with our traditional allies, Israel, Egypt, Jordan, the UAE. Based on your recent experiences, where are those areas where we think we can have the most success and progress with these partnerships, and where we can enhance and strengthen these relationships across the broad security spectrum in the coming years?
Well, I think one of the key areas is where we have developed good relationships and good capacity already. We're looking at the ambassador from the UAE to the United States right here, Ambassador Taiba, I think is a good example of a country that has made an investment in their own defense and in their own capabilities, and has the ability to be a leader in the region. And so I think one of the first things we ought to be doing is we ought to be focusing on that and strengthening those relationships and using those to help achieve what our common objectives are across the region.
It is a region that has had just tremendous change if we look at across a 30-year period. One of the questions also on everyone's mind is the status of the campaign on ISIL as we watch that. That's Mosul. There have been some reports that ISIL is moving toward the use of chemical munitions. Give us your sense on the degree of that threat, and what additional steps might need to be taken in that particular area.
Yeah, good, thanks. I'd love to do that. Let me just preempt that by just talking a little bit about the strategy and about the campaign plan. As many of you know, we had the opportunity this week to have many of the chiefs of defense from the coalition nations that make up our coalition here in Washington, and an opportunity to talk with them about where we were in the campaign and how we're moving forward both in the Middle East and more broadly against the Islamic threat. And I would tell you that I think the key watchwords for me, and as I talk to our commanders and talk to the coalition here for our campaign plan, is momentum and pressure. It is extraordinarily important that we keep momentum up for our activities, and that's one of the things we've really focused on over the last several months here, is to make sure that there is a lot of activity that we are continuing to pursue out there, because it supports the other notion, and that's this notion of constant pressure on the Islamic State. If you looked at our strategy and you want to boil it down to a very simple approach, it's been to try to present the Islamic State with as many dilemmas as we possibly can, whether it is our operations on the ground, whether it is our airstrikes, whether it is going after their resources, forces, whether it is disrupting their ability to exploit oil for their own revenue purposes, whether it's been going after their leadership, whether it's been addressing their information operations. All of that together is, I think, what's contributing to the momentum that is allowing us to move forward and is allowing us to keep pressure on them. That said, this is an adaptive enemy, and as you highlighted here by what you just asked about, the threat we've seen from chemical weapons, mustard, sulfur in particular. I mean, these are things we have to be aware of. This is an adaptive enemy. We have to respect. We don't respect their ideology, but we respect them as an adversary. And so they are working diligently to try to come up with new ways that they can have an impact on us. My impression of this particular threat right now, it has not been tactically or operationally significant at this particular point. That said, it is concerning. There is a psychological impact to it. I recognize the impact of a chemical round, the report of a chemical round landing in the vicinity of coalition forces or U.S. forces, and what that might mean. So we have been very, very focused on with our targeting to go after those places where we think this is being produced, those individuals that are producing it, the resources they require to do that. In many cases, this is pretty low level, so we can't see all of that. They're still out there. It's not an overly sophisticated threat at this particular point, but yet it is out there. And so we've got to continue to address that. So we're doing it from an offensive standpoint, but importantly, we're also looking at it from a defensive standpoint, and that is making sure that Iraqi forces, Peshmerga forces, are trained to deal with this and have the equipment that they need. Certainly coalition forces have the training and equipment they need to deal with it. And then, of course, when we see an event like that, is to quickly, one of the things we've learned from IEDs is the ability to exploit and understand what they're doing is really important for us to develop countermeasures, whether those are technology or whether it's training or tactics or techniques, very quickly. So we're working all of those things to try to address that particular aspect.
One of the other pieces that I know is on your mind and on the mind of the allies, and that is the immense humanitarian suffering that's going on. Give us a sense of how that calculates into your planning and your looking at the region.
Well,
I know you spend a tremendous amount of time on
it's
that.
extraordinarily important, and just using the example that I think we're seeing playing out right now with Mosul is as we approach the military planning for Mosul. One of the things that we tried to do from a coalition military standpoint is to make sure that our military planning was done in conjunction with the humanitarian planning and certainly with the political planning that has to take place for what comes after that. So I think it's important to make sure that the things we're trying to do militarily are linked to the things we're trying to do humanitarian wise. And so I think we've learned a lot. We learned a lot from places like Fallujah, where we did all of a sudden an operation that moved very fast and all of a sudden resulted in a lot of internally displaced people that we did not have a good plan for. Iraqis did not have a good plan for. And so we've learned with that, and so there has been a significant amount of planning for that. The UN has certainly been a leader in this. The Kurdistan, the KRG has been a leader in this, and certainly the government of Iraq and the coalition has been partners in that. And of course, our Department of State has been key in raising the resources and that stuff for that, which is very much appreciated. And I think you've seen on TV that you've seen some of the experts talk about the ability and what we're trying to do with that. So I think there's been very, very good planning in place. That I'm pretty pleased with that. That said, I will tell you, it's much more difficult for humanitarian planners to plan for their activities than it is for us to plan for our military activities. This really is a little bit of art and science here. I mean, the military piece is a little bit of science. We have a little bit more control over that. We have less control, I think, over the humanitarian aspect and how that plays out. Importantly, and I'll finish on this, is the Prime Minister, I think, of Iraq has been very focused on this. And I think as you look at the operation that is unfolding right now, one of the key things they are trying to do is move quickly and get to Mosul further human disaster to what we have. They've done I think a pretty good job of through information operations, leaflet drops, and a variety of other things, radio, television, to try to communicate to the people in Mosul to the best they can that if you are not in dire problems, stay where you are. And don't move, don't contribute to the problem of that. So going fast, communicating with them, having the planning and contingencies in place are really how we're approaching it.
No, and I know many from our CAP team, and probably many in the room, have been to the region, met with refugees, understand and see the activities of the NGOs on the humanitarian side. Particularly Jordan seems to be a key destination of as safe a zone as possible in terms of refugees that are trying to leave Iraq as ISIL came. And so I think helping the refugees, getting them settled, will be a key issue for governance of the region going forward. It's a huge humanitarian problem. There have been a number of tactical counterterrorism victories over the last 8 years, and as someone who has been deeply involved in those victories, how are the tactical successes leading toward sort of a strategic resolution with the phenomenon of ISIL and the radical jihad?
Well, I think what the tactical victories do for us is they allow us to prevail, to score a point, if you will, and to move forward and to capitalize on a strength. So even as you just look at kind of the campaign in Iraq and Syria, I mean looking at how we are deconstructing the physical caliphate, for example, I think is a good example. So what we want to do is when we do achieve a tactical victory, a particular battle that our partners are able to do, we want to be able to capitalize on that with governance, with stability, with humanitarian aid to make sure that we continue to do that. So in that particular area, I think that's one of the things you're seeing. I think one of the other things that we're beginning to see is we're beginning to see more and more willing partners out there that are developing capabilities that can help us in these areas. Mm-hmm. So we've been well supported with some of the authorities that we've been given to train partner forces out there, and in places in the area that I lead now to other areas that I'm familiar with in the Horn of Africa, we've been able to develop partner forces that have been able with U.S. training, with U.S. backing, some equipping, some advise and assist, have been very capable of going after some of the threats that are local to them. So I think what we're trying to do really is develop local forces that can address the local problems, and then use kind of the high-end capabilities the United States has, or some of our partners, to really go after the threats that really go cross boundaries, go between regions, and address that. So I think that's one of the things that tactical victories allow us to do as we move forward, is to capitalize on the investments we're making, address situations locally where we can, and then where we have to look at these trans-regional threats.
The complexities of the region, you've got a big maritime element as well. There's shipping off the coast of Yemen. We take for granted the opening of the strategic Straits of Hormuz in terms of less the American energy supply, but more the global energy supply, and particularly looking to Asia. Can you speak to the international shipping piece right now that's off the shore there in Yemen, and that part of the?
Yeah, so great question. Certainly one of the key U.S. interests, and I would suggest a global interest, is the strategic choke points that emanate from the central region, and you're really talking about the Bab el-Mandeb right now between the Horn of Africa and Arabian Peninsula, and certainly we've seen some activity over the last couple of weeks there with that. It's a great concern. Frankly, if you look at it geographically, it's actually a little more compressed than the Straits of Hormuz are, just in physical size. So it's extraordinarily important area here. And on a day-to-day basis, right now, there's 60 to 70 ships that go through that area every day, moving commerce, security-wise, other things that go on through there. So it's an extraordinarily important location. So as we've watched the situation in Yemen play out, I think what we are seeing now is a concern that some of the elements there have obtained weapons or equipment that have allowed them to potentially influence some of that navigation, and I think that's certainly a concern for us, and it's a concern for many other partners right here. So what we're trying to do, I think, right now, and I think everyone's aware, we did respond to an incident here against one of our vessels, and we continue to investigate some other incidents here, but we did take action against radar systems that we thought were linked to the attacks that we saw against our vessels here a week or so ago. So what I'm interested in doing right now is making sure we understand that threat. This is not an area where we've had a long-term investment of ISR and other things there, so it is important for us to understand what's happening there. And working with a variety of coalition partners and other partners in the region, we're working very hard to increase our understanding of the physical threat, and then the leadership that's behind that, and how it's being orchestrated.
Let me ask one more question, and then we'll start to open it up and engage our audience. But, as we have moved really from the Arabian Peninsula more to the Red Sea and the Straits of Hormuz, that brings us to the other big bookend of the region, which is Iran and its strategy and its game. Talk to us in terms of how you see Iran in the region, particularly from the security side, and then offer your perspectives in terms of how we strategically engage with that threat.
Well, great question. So, despite the fact that we've concluded an agreement with the Iranians through the JCPOA that addressed an extraordinarily important threat, their behavior has generally not changed in the region. They still are a force of instability in our view. We certainly see that in places like the Straits of Hormuz. One of the very first things that I did early on in my tenure as a CENTCOM commander was get on one of our ships going through the Straits of Hormuz so I could see it myself. And the Iranians did not disappoint. Within 15 minutes of being on the ship, some were with me, they were there. We had a rocket ship. We had all kinds of stuff beside us. So they continued to be very assertive and aggressive against our ships and others that operate in international waters in places like the Straits of Hormuz. And there's no other Navy that does that. No one else in the region does that, and I'm unaware of anybody else that really does that anywhere else, that operates in that particular fashion. It's unprofessional from a maritime standpoint, and we certainly would encourage them to stop that activity. And then, of course, as you look around the region, and we see Hezbollah, which is a product of Iran, continues to play a destabilizing role in supporting the regime and the activities they're taking against their own people in western Syria. We've seen them foment instability in Yemen with their support of the Houthis, and playing out surrogate operations against some of our longstanding partners in the region, certainly within Baghdad, we see a large number of Shia militia groups that have been put together largely at the behest of Iran. And while they've played a role in some of the operations, I think we have to think through what we and certainly the Iraqis and others have to think through what role they play in the long term there. So, I think there are a couple things we need to do. I think first and foremost is we need to make sure we maintain the solid relationships that we have in place with our long-term partners in the region. That's very, very important, I think, and making sure that they understand, we understand what's going on here with this. And then, certainly there are diplomatic aspects of this. There are things I think we should at least consider from a security standpoint to improve our communications. I'd certainly like to be able to communicate to the Iranians when we see unprofessional behavior. I don't know if it's the actions of a rogue commander or if it's something that's being centrally disseminated. I don't have that insight. So, I think if there was a way we could potentially do that, I think it would be helpful. It would be helpful to a military leader, I think, to understand that. So, I think continuing to build relationships with our partners, reassure them, making sure that we are holding Iran accountable for the things that they are doing. And then looking for ways to approach them diplomatically and to push back on their activities and to become a positive force in the region and not another source of instability.
Thank you for that. And I think, your three key points early on, listening to the region, reinforcing relationships, and then being responsive to our partners, even as the region is in a tremendous period of change economically. So with the oil changing globally in terms of the price and new sources of energy, making sure that we're hearing exactly what the concerns are, I think, is one of the great challenges. I'd like to start now taking some questions from our audience. What I'm going to do is ask that you wait until the microphone comes, and we're going to try and balance between members of the press who are here, and then we have some from the academic and think tank world, and so we want to make sure that we can get as many questions in as possible. I'd ask that you ask questions and not give speeches, but let's start, and we'll start with Eric Schmidt.
Eric Schmidt with the New York Times. A two-part question, General. First, you said it's important to keep pressure and momentum on ISIS. How important is it then, while the campaign in Mosul is now underway, to also have the campaign in Raqqa go forward, even if you may not have the forces exactly in place on the ground? And second, to get into your question in the Red Sea, what can you tell us now about who is responsible for those attacks, or at least the missile attacks? Were they Houthis only? Or do you also see Iranian influence in helping influence those attacks?
Thanks, Eric.
Thank you.
So let me answer your first question first here on the importance of Raqqa and keeping pressure on others. I think it's extraordinarily important, and we are certainly attempting to do that. I think what we've seen is when we apply pressure on the Islamic State forces, they do squirt out. They try to go to other locations. They move leaders. They move their bulk of their forces. They try to relocate some of their operations. So I think it's the simultaneous application of pressure is very important for the campaign. So I think it's extraordinarily important. And there's a variety of ways we can do that. We can isolate. We can hold terrain to prevent their movement. We can go after them with airstrikes. We can get our partner forces focused on them. So I think there's a variety of things we can do. But I think it's extraordinarily important to apply pressure in many areas, Iraq and Syria. To your second question here, frankly, some of the technologies that we've seen there, I think, are things that are associated with the Iranian threat that we've seen. It's not totally exclusive to them. There certainly are others that have shore-based missiles that may be moving that in there. So I do think Iran is playing a role in some of this. They have a relationship with the Houthis. So I do suspect there is a role in that. That said, there's also the former the regime there that the Saleh regime that may have some aspects of that as well. So I think what I indicated to you is what we are trying to do is make sure we understand this as much as we can. So we can properly attribute what is happening and understand how these attacks are taking place, and more importantly, how the decisions are being made to launch these attacks so that we can take action against that.
Let's look for the gentleman in the light blue shirt. just please, everyone, identify yourself when you ask the question.
Yeah, hi, Tony Hausner.
And you're with?
I'm just a
Citizen.
a citizen, right? I'd like to know your thoughts on how we move forward between Israel and Palestine to achieve possibly a two-state solution.
Of the many things that are occurring within the 20-country area of CENTCOM, that's not necessarily one that I'm directly dealing with. I think the one thing about that I've learned about CENTCOM, and learned, but I relearned, I think is probably a better term here, is that the things that do happen on our periphery matter. Whether it's certainly with our very good NATO ally to the north here in Turkey, or whether it's the Israeli-Palestine issue, or what is happening in Libya, that's on our periphery. The Horn of Africa is on our periphery, and certainly the Pac-India relationship is on our periphery as well. So I think it's important that we have to pay attention to that. We can't just think about what's happening internal to CENTCOM. I'm not sure I would be able to offer you much more on that. I certainly think that that's an underlying issue, that one of the many underlying issues that has to be addressed in the area, and that moving forward on that. I know there's been certainly a lot of efforts on that. We would obviously, from a CENTCOM standpoint, would be very supportive of that. I think it's one of the key underlying issues that impacts the region, certainly impacts and inflames things in our region. So we're obviously very, very supportive of that. And I think the things that we can do is to continue to, more indirectly, is continue to build confidence building measures between different partners in the region. I think this is an extraordinarily important aspect of what we do, particularly as I talk about the things that happen on our periphery that aren't necessarily in the CENTCOM region, but overlap. Either we over CENTCOM going out from CENTCOM or coming into CENTCOM. I think it's important that we look to how we use confidence-building measures between different partners here to move forward on really these important underlying issues like you just raised right here, the Israeli-Palestinian aspect.
Watch our space. Actually, we were able to host yesterday a U.S. Army 3-star general who is assigned to our diplomatic mission in country, and his principal mission is to be a security coordinator between the West Bank and the Israeli security forces. He has a very tough job, but he is very earnest. Again, he's a 3-star, has done his missions in Afghanistan and Iraq, and is now more in a diplomatic space. He follows a distinguished line of senior flag officers who have been in that position. But he's got a very interesting assignment, and I think he'd probably like to share some of those. So we'll look to see how we might be able to get that discussion going here as well. We'll go to the gentleman right there, and then we'll go over to the left next.
I'm Paul Soni from the Wall Street Journal. I have 2 questions for you. One is, you mentioned the potential threat, or however you would characterize it, of the PMUs going forward in Iraq. What is your sense on how that might get resolved, and how much of a threat it is to Iraqi stability, potentially after the battle with Islamic State? And the second question is, we've seen a fairly dramatic increase in Russian air defenses in the theater, and I'm wondering how, and there's been some suggestions that some of those new defenses could cover Raqqa or the area around there. How is that affecting your plans for combating Islamic State in that area?
Thanks. Great question. Let me take the second one first here. With the Russian activity in Syria, for better than a year, we've had a pretty effective deconfliction mechanism in place with them, and it operates out of our Air Operations Center, and it allows us to have a professional military discussion with the Russian Federation Russian Federation Air Force in particular, to make sure that we do ensure safe flight operations between the coalition, between the Russian Federation in places like that. And that has, I think, served us very well. I think as we move forward and additional systems and other things are introduced into the area, I think that highlights the importance of this effort, and it means that we have to continue to stay in a dialogue on this, and we have to look at how we update our deconfliction methods to make sure that everybody can stay safe. And so that's of key importance to us. With respect to the Russian radar, certainly we're tracking that. It has not had an impact on our operations to date, largely because of the deconfliction chain that we have in place and some things we've been able to do with them over time. So we'll certainly continue to pay very, very close attention to that. And I'm sorry, your first question was on the Shia PMFs. So ultimately, this is an Iraqi decision. They will have to deal with that. There are certainly a lot of groups that have been raised as a result of kind of the emergency that has taken place in Iraq over the last couple of years. I think it will be important that if there are those groups that will remain, that they be integrated into the Iraqi security infrastructure and part of the architecture, and they're responsive and accountable to the leadership of the country, the prime minister. I think that's extraordinarily important. I also think that looking forward, I think we have to look at the Iraqis will have to look at how much they really need and how much they can sustain. I don't know if they need 100,000 going forward. There may be some need for some portion of that. Some of those probably can be demobilized and probably should be demobilized. So I think those are the things I think from someone who coalition standpoint and providing advice to our partners on the ground, what we would encourage them to be thinking about.
Let me just look here. The gentleman in the center there. Yep. With the glasses.
Hi, I usually go with the guy with the mustache, but I can do with the glasses.
Glasses.
Talal Absi from the Embassy of Bahrain. The question to you, sir, is that there's kind of this new kind of growing perception that the relevance of, or rather the irrelevance of U.S. traditional allies' contribution to the national security of the United States. And I was wondering, is that of concern to you? Have you been addressing it as Central Command, kind of to convey like the realities on the ground, which happen like thousands of miles away, and the public are not aware of?
I'm sorry, I may not understand the first part of your question there.
So I'm saying there's this growing perception in the United States that kind of the idea of free riding, that the U.S. traditional allies in the region are not contributing to the national security of the United States, and whether it's that's something of concern to CENTCOM, and whether you have been addressing it.
Yeah, a great question, and I think an important part of my responsibility is to make sure that that our leadership understands the role that our partners in the region play, and in some cases it is direct military capability that they provide to our ongoing operations where we have common objectives, and then in other cases it's it's access, basing, overflight capabilities they provide to us that are absolutely vital. You're from Bahrain. We are extraordinarily dependent on Bahrain for the support that you provide for Fifth Fleet. We could not do what we do in the maritime environment around the Central Command region without the support of Bahrain from that aspect. So in my discussions with the leadership that I talk with, and whether it's at the congressional level or in the department or others that I come in contact with, part of my responsibility, I think, is to make sure we understand, they understand, we understand, are articulating very clearly what the contributions of our partners are making. All partners are contributing to to our common interests here. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's a military force. There are other ways to contribute to this, and so I think it's important for me to do that, and I hope that I am doing that, and I look forward to continuing doing it.
And that's a really good topic to bring up with the panel that's coming next, and that's actually a topic that's addressed in the report. What I would like to do is take 3 questions, and then that will sort of close it out. So the gentleman that I'm looking directly at is 1. The gentleman with the white shirt is number 2, and the gentleman with the glasses and the white shirt is number 3. 1, 2, 3.
Thank you. Mohammed Ghanem with the Syrian American Council. So since we're talking about the challenges in the region, I was hoping to hear more about Syria today, since it's the number 1 challenge. So I'm going to ask you a question about Syria. Recently, the Syrian rebels, backed by Turkey, made spectacular gains against ISIS, and in the span of 9 hours only, were able to clear out ISIS from the entire border region with Turkey. Based on that success, is CENTCOM contemplating stepped-up cooperation with them? What about a partnership, let's say, to retake Raqqa? Or is CENTCOM focused for the time being on the YPG? Thank you.
Okay, so there's 1. And we'll take question 2. We'll take these all in sequence.
I got to remember all these?
Well,
okay. All right, good. Okay, that's good. Go ahead.
This is Thomas Gorgisi with Al-Ahram, Egypt. Talking about the partnership with Egypt, what kind of cooperation, or you can mention now about first Sinai and ISIL, whether it's ISIL or terrorism, different kind of terrorism, and second, the possibility of spillover from Libya and the chaotic situation. My second question is regarding can you give us any update about Operation Bright Star?
Thank you.
okay. And third question.
Thank you very much, General Alexander Kravitz from Insight Iraq. I understand you're going to be flying traveling to Iraq shortly, and I wanted to ask you, can you give us a sense of how long, you talked about the plans earlier at the beginning of your talk in response to a question, that things seem to be going either on schedule or ahead of schedule. I'm wondering if you could give us a sense of how long it might take for, Prime Minister Abadi to plant the flag. But the second question is, what about the day after, meaning the political solution? Ultimately, you're not going to bring stability to the region unless there is a political agreement. And I'm wondering, what's the thinking, and might you be talking to political leaders there about that on your next trip? Thank you.
So, okay, ready?
So, Syria, Egypt, and Iraq.
Okay, Syria and Turkey. Because I think that's really what you're asking about. And let me just start off by saying that our NATO ally, Turkey, to the north of CENTCOM, has been extraordinarily important for the campaign. We could not do what we're doing in Syria right now without their support. Certainly, the basing and other things we get, the support we get from Turkey is absolutely essential to what we're doing. The operations that they have undertaken along the border, starting at Jarabulus and moving to the west, and which most recently resulted in the seizure of Dabiq, I think took a little bit longer than 9 hours, but nonetheless, it was successful. And it was an operation that needed to be done, and it addressed a very important aspect of the Islamic State, where they were controlling a portion of the border, and they've taken that away from them. We did that through a combination of coalition support, air support, the Turkish military, and some of the opposition elements that we've been training and developing over time. In this case, with the Turks, and so I think certainly as we move forward, we'll look at. I think we always have to look at the capabilities of these different organizations and what they're capable of doing, the size, the sophistication of the things we're asking them to do, and we have to make sure that we match their capabilities to the things we're asking them to do. So as we move forward, we'll continue to look at the forces we have available and the missions that we need, and we'll try to make sure we set all of our partners up for success moving forward, whether it's continuing to stabilize in that particular area, or whether it's going on to other objectives in northern Syria. So, I think to me it's important that we, that as coalition members and working here, we understand what the capabilities of our partners are, and we don't overextend them. Just because it's not us necessarily leading the fight doesn't mean we don't care about the contributions and the sacrifices that they are making. We certainly do, and so it'll be important. You mentioned the Syrian Kurdish forces. Certainly, the Syrian Kurdish forces is part of an entity we call the Syrian Democratic Forces, which has been the Syrian Kurds and Syrian Arabs and Turkmen and others that have come along have been a successful force for us, and working from places like Kobani and expanding out there, and now really controlling an extraordinarily large amount of terrain in northern Syria. It's been a very capable force for us. So again, we'll have to look at what they need to. How we can use them going forward. We're certainly not naive about the challenges here. We certainly understand the tensions between Turkey and the Kurds in Syria. We certainly understand the ethnic aspects and sectarian aspects of villages across northern Syria, and so we have to take all that in consideration. It is an extraordinary complex job, and what we are trying to do is we are trying to take it a step at a time. Move forward, solve a problem, then move on to the other ones here. I think if we try to solve everything at one particular time, we won't get anything done. I just remind you, one of the important things is to continue the momentum against ISIL, and that is the one kind of common unifying factor here. It is about beating ISIL. And we're being successful with it, whether it's using the Turkish forces and their opposition elements, or whether it's using the Syrian Democratic forces. And we're trying to use the coalition forces to help move that along, lower tensions where they exist, and keep everybody moving in the right direction with that. So it'll be extraordinarily complex as we move forward, but that's what we're paid to do, and I think we've got the right people focusing on it. I think the second question was about Egypt and about the Sinai. First off, let me once again compliment Egypt on the role that they play. We talked about some of the strategic waterways in the area, and we talked about the Bab el-Mandeb, and we talked about the Straits of Hormuz. But the third one is the Suez Canal, and that has long been a key location for us. I mean, nothing gets done if we can't get through the Suez, and so the Egyptians for a long time have been the guarantors of security through there, and they continue to improve their security and continue to support us in a very significant way. Us and the rest of the coalition that are conducting operations right there. The Sinai, I think, represents another area where we've seen the cancer of ISIL metastasize. We have been working with the Egyptian forces and how they address that in the Sinai. One of the more tangible ways that we've been working with them is helping them confront the threat of improvised explosive devices. As you know, IEDs, improvised explosive devices, is a principal tactic that ISIL has taken to a new level in mass and volume and just in the way that they are using them. And so one of the things that we have tried to work, and are very effectively, I think, working with our Egyptian partners on is the equipping, the tactics, the training, the approach that they should take in operating in that particular environment. That's certainly something we've learned over our experience, and we learned it the hard way. But now we've got good capability, and we're able to export that. So I think that's a real tangible way that we are working very closely with the Egyptian forces right now to address the threat of the Islamic State in the Sinai. And the last question was
Iraq.
Oh, Bright Star. Yeah. We haven't done a Bright Star in a number of years, the reason why essentially is to op tempo. Everybody's been busy, and it's been difficult to orchestrate an operation like that. When I was last in Cairo and last had an opportunity to talk with with our Egyptian military partners, we had an extensive talk about our exercise program and trying to get that back on track. And so we are moving forward with that. I can't announce to you that we're going to be doing it, but we have initiated discussions between my headquarters and the Ministry of Defense in Cairo, and we look forward to moving forward with that. That is, whether it will be the same bright star that we did in the past, we may not need to do that. There might be something else more contemporary we can do, but we certainly understand the value of that exercise, what it meant to our relationship, what it meant to everybody else that participates in it. So we think that's something we definitely want to move forward on. The last issue was
Iraq.
Yeah, I'm not going to make an estimate to you on planting the timeline. I think the Iraqi leaders have talked about it. I think the coalition leaders that have talked about it have talked in terms of weeks to months in terms of that. I'll give you an example. The operation we did to Manbij in northern Syria took about 71 days to complete from start to finish. Raqqa is about 3 times the size of Manbij. Mosul is about 3 times the size of Raqqa. So we should expect that it's going to take some time to do that. And while I emphasize to you that that part of the strategy here for addressing the humanitarian aspect is to move quickly, the other thing that the Prime Minister has emphasized to the coalition, to his forces, is that we have to take into consideration the impact on the civilians there. So we want to move fast enough that we keep pressure on the enemy, and we continue to make momentum towards our objective, but we want to move slow enough that we don't add to the human disaster that could take place there. So I think we'll work that kind of yin and yang as we move forward. As I've traveled to Iraq over the last several months, I've seen increasing confidence in the Iraqi leadership and their ability to orchestrate an operation like this, and I think we're seeing that in the first few days here. And they will look for opportunities to move quickly where they can, and then they'll also look at how they balance it moving forward. But I think this is going to be a complex fight. The Islamic State's had 2 years to prepare this area. So there's going to be a lot to contend with. And we should expect there'll be some setbacks. There'll be some very heavy fighting. We expect that there will be, but I think the weeks to months is probably about the right, about as comfortable as I would be to telling you that right now. The other part of your question was the day after. Yeah. So I mentioned that as we do military planning for these things, we particularly for Mosul, we tried to make sure we synced our military planning with the humanitarian planning and with the political planning that had to take place with this. Certainly, Mosul represents a very significant location, not just because it's the self-declared capital of the caliphate, and where al-Baghdadi declared himself the caliph, and he declared the caliphate here a couple years ago. It's important from that aspect, but it's also certainly a lot of different groups that are represented up there. So it's a complex problem. And as we approached our planning, we kept that foremost in mind. And I know the Prime Minister has established a high-level commission that involves not only the Nineveh province leadership, to include the tribes and the provincial leadership there, but also includes the KRG, and it includes the government of Iraq. And so there is a mechanism for them to begin to address the political aspects of this. An important part of the overall operation has been making sure that we brought the tribal forces in the broader Nineveh area involved into this, so that they can take responsibility for their particular areas as we clear through those. So it's very complex, but there certainly has been a lot of work done to date on that. There certainly will need to be more work done as we move forward, but I think the mechanisms are beginning to be put in place to do that. The fact that this operation is being done in such close coordination between the Kurdistan regional government and the government of Iraq, to me, is a watershed. That's not an automatic thing. And it took an awful lot of work to do, and it took an awful lot of work on the part of the Kurdish leadership and the government of Iraq leadership to come together so that they could actually orchestrate this kind of combined operation, where Iraqi forces are using Kurdish Kurdish territory to launch their operations from. So to me, this is we're in a little different area right here. I'm not looking at this through rose-colored glasses. There's certainly going to be a lot that has to be addressed there, but the basics, I think, are beginning to be put in place with respect to that.
So, General, first let me thank you. Our hour has gone quickly, but first let me thank you for being here at the Center for American Progress today. Let me thank you for your service to the United States in one of the most complex regions and complex jobs ever invented. And let me also just simply express our thanks to the men and women of the Armed Forces of the United States who serve around the world, but particularly for those who are under your command. I know you think of them constantly, and we think of them for their service. We think of them for their sacrifice. We thank you for sharing this time, and we wish you all the best in these many challenging issues.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Appreciate it. Thank you very much. Thank you.
We will briefly reset, and Vikram and the panel will start almost immediately.
Good to see you.
Yes, before people vote.
Hey, Derek, how you doing? Good to see you. Hey, Vikram, good to see you.
Hi, Linda.
All right. Well, everybody can regroup in here, grab some refreshments, and thanks for sticking around for discussion, more in-depth discussion to follow on that great dialogue that Rudy and General Votel just had. We want to take a little bit of time to get in depth with experts who have dealt with this region and these challenges for many, many years. And I know Rudy introduced everyone, but to my far left is Mike Singh, who is not related to me, and who served.
As far as we know.
As far as we know.
That's right.
It could be true. It could be different, but if he were, we would be a great pair because we'd be ideologically in different camps, but pragmatically aligned in trying to do smart things for the country. And he served with great distinction in the Bush administration, was a very key advisor to Secretary Condoleezza Rice and to Secretary Powell. Derek, who many of you know, is now at the German Marshall Fund, was most recently Assistant Secretary of Defense for National Security Affairs, so had the responsibility for basically all of the players that we see as primary actors on the stage in the Middle East. Linda, who has distinguished herself as everything from a journalist to an advisor to the highest levels of the U.S. military, and has become really one of the great experts on this concept of how you can build partner forces to effectively get things done, and who I've had the pleasure of working with in many different capacities. It's great to have you here. And then Brian, who leads our Middle East work and has really tried to push forward with a different kind of vision for how we handle the Middle East, including with this report. So I'm going to start with Brian right away to just run us through what's different here. Your focus has really been on a longer term look. How do we start thinking about the Middle East as it will be in the future and paving a path towards that? So why don't you just walk us through some of the highlights here?
Great. Thanks, Vikram, and thanks to the panel for all coming, and thanks to all of you for allowing us to hit pause for a couple hours on our national collective reality TV show, what's going on in the election, and try to have a focused discussion. The report that you have out there, I should note, is really a team product, and it's the product of going out to the region for several years. And I know many people from different countries around the region are here, and you've indulged us quite a lot to try to help us understand what's going on in the region. And we also benefited a lot through many peer review sessions from people who served in the Obama, Bush, Clinton administrations and things like that. What I thought I'd do is just for maybe 5 minutes highlight the main arguments and what's new here, and to your point. 3 core arguments that we have, and the first may seem simple, but I think is important to stress in this context. Number one, the Middle East still matters for U.S. national security interests. That at a time when there's real questions about the global order and the system that was set up after the end of the Cold War, strains from China, from Russia, from climate change and other things, there is a debate about whether we should just rebalance or pivot to other parts of the world. And I think at times it leaves the impression that we don't have a stake in what matters. I think what we've seen, especially the last 2 or 3 years, is what happens in the region doesn't stay there. And it's not only the ISIL threat and the problem of ideology, it's a number of strains that things like refugees have placed on the global system. And I think reiterating that and refreshing sort of that list that the U.S. has had for decades of support for Israel, for oil, and energy resources was important to try to do, and we do that in the report. Second, an argument we're making at this point is that with a new administration coming in, it offers an opportunity to look a little bit beyond the horizon. And here I think is a constructive criticism of how the current and then previous administrations have operated, especially since 9/11. That the policy framework that we've found ourselves in the United States has been very reactive, crisis management driven, and sometimes very tactical. I remembered I had very, very junior positions in the Clinton administration in the 90s. And there was at least a sense of sort of a forward affirmative vision on multiple fronts, including in the Middle East. And if you take a step back from the day-to-day, we often don't have that, I think, at this point. And I think a third argument, which is sort of the theme of this report, this event, and then an event we're going to have next week with a couple of ambassadors from the region, and Mike Morrell and Sandy Winnefeld, is partnerships. That the U.S. can't do it all, and I think there's been if you look at who we acknowledge in the report as reviewers, we've had people who served, as I mentioned, in the Bush, Clinton, and Obama administrations. And I think there's just been a collective sense among analysts of what do we do about this in the region. And I think one of the answers that I think the Obama administration particularly has landed on is building partnerships together. And I think that's important at this point. And as we note in the report, with some of our traditional partners, there is a two-way trust deficit. And I think it's quite clear it's an accumulation of problems, not just from recent years, but from the last 10 or 15 years. Many of our traditional partners in the region see the U.S. in certain ways, and I think there's a lot of confusion. And I think, as we see in recent events in Congress, legislation on Saudi Arabia and other things, there's a shift in the United States. So there is a two-way trust deficit in these traditional partners. So what do we do about it? And quickly, we're trying to distill down briefly. But in the short run, we argue that a new administration needs to come in and in particular place a strong premium on trying to decrease this trust deficit with some of our traditional partners. That if President Obama came in with, I think, the right approach to try to engage Iran on the nuclear issue and get what I think was a very important agreement, the way we went about doing that, the way we responded to certain things like the Arab uprisings and the anti-ISIL campaign hasn't actually reassured a lot of our partners in the region. So I think we need to have a doubling down of our engagement with some of these traditional partners. Let me be clear. By doubling down, I don't mean blank checks or unquestioned sort of embraces of these partners. I think it's more quiet, tough discussions, and the important part, as we highlight, is pressing some of our partners of what their long-term vision is. What I've learned through our research the last couple of years is we're crystal clear on what they see as the threats. They see Iran. In some cases, it's political Islam. There's a collective, I think, concern of al-Qaeda and ISIL. What is often missing is that long-term affirmative vision. Where do our partners actually want to be in 2020, 2025? And it's almost naive or Pollyannish, it sounds so, to try to have that discussion in public just because of the multiple disasters. At one point, we were thinking about calling this report a Silver Linings Playbook. You can't do that in this part of the world when there's so many disasters that are happening, but that private discussion, I think, needs to happen with partners. So the first thing is, I think, doing that quietly as opposed to big speeches, and perhaps leading to, and we suggest, an opportunity, maybe after the end of the first year, of a Madrid-like moment, that if we're seeing some momentum in the anti-ISIL campaign, if we're seeing some momentum in dealing with some of the threats in the region, you might be able to bring a certain grouping of these countries together. It won't be like 1991 after the Gulf War, because the structure of the region has changed, but I think it's important to try to drive towards, for what purpose? To, again, what is the longer term collective agenda that we have? Second, and briefly, clearly we've talked with General Votel about Iran and its destabilizing role, and I think the Obama administration has put into place some of the consultation mechanisms and the GCC efforts, following through on that and doing it in a way that actually protects the nuclear agreement, makes sure that Iran's abiding by it, I think is important. And then thirdly, and we very briefly mentioned this, we have longer reports that deal with most aspects of this, but the various civil wars and conflicts, that this problem of fragmentation in the region and state fragmentation actually is an issue that is, quite frankly, a result of not only what Iran and other actors do, but sometimes the tactics that are used by some of our partners. So stitching together sort of what is a cohesive plan in the short run. Very briefly on the longer term, because I think it's important to have that longer term agenda mapped out. And here in three areas, I think, again, what is often discussed is the battle of ideas, and has been talked about for almost 15 years. And I think it's important to stress this, that it's not just about countering violent extremism. I think there's a new wave, which I think is appropriate, but to me, as an analyst and a lot on our team, incomplete, about how do we defeat the violent extremism that's out there. And I think part of what we've seen in our research in multiple places, from Tunisia to Egypt to Jordan and others, is an emptiness in the political dialogue, a lack of openness in the alternatives to this, and allowing and working with partners in the region to say there needs to be more space to have this debate, to talk about this. Another component of the battle ideas is just respect for individuals, whatever their faith is. And we've talked quite a lot and done some work on the issue of Christians and other religious minorities and people who aren't people of faith. And I think an engagement that talks about that in that longer term battle is key to CVE. Second is the economics, and we have a longer section on this and a lot more work to be done. But obviously the region is going to have to face a lot of choices about how do these societies reconstruct themselves. And what we propose is a Middle East reconstruction bank, something that the U.S. itself would not fund. There's not opportunity to do this, but use its diplomatic leverage to think longer term over the next decade about what needs to be done in the region to help places like Yemen, like Syria, to reconstruct themselves. And then finally, and we can talk a little bit more about this, and Linda and I have been talking extensively, is that the U.S. is still, I think, the security partner of choice of most of the countries in the region, when you think about it. For all of what Russia's been able to do to punch, I think, above its weight in certain parts of Syria, it's often overstated when you do a clinical analysis of who has which partnerships, and the U.S. is unrivaled. I don't think sometimes we drive those partnerships towards that longer-term vision. So we have a couple of ideas in there about, for instance, a Middle East stabilization force. And when we talked to our friends in CENTCOM about this, they said, great idea, you got to have stretch goals. May not be something you can do in 2017, but to the point that the U.S. actually has very robust either military assistance programs, cooperation, and sales with the region. It's often not stitched together in a broader framework. So I went on longer than 5 minutes, but the central theme, I think, what we're trying to offer our team here is that if you look at where the U.S. has been, and especially over the last 40 years, which is much of my life and a little bit more, actually I am over 40. I think we're reaching a point where the U.S., for political reasons or for policy reasons, is really trying to figure out what is its new strategic engagement with the region and find a way to strike the right balance. And what we propose is a model of, if the U.S. has become a security guarantor of many of our partners in the region, we should maintain that role, reassure them, but then continue the efforts that I think have been tried to play a role of strategic integrator in the region, to help the Middle East become like other regions of the world, where you can actually see partners working more robustly together, not only on immediate crises like Yemen or Syria or Iraq, but on longer term, the fabric of how do you actually help the region become much more stable.
Thank you, Brian, and thanks for all the hard work getting this together. It's a very ambitious thing in this many pages to try to put out a vision for the Middle East, and everybody here had a role in helping shape it. So we appreciate that. Mike, I want to turn to you next. I'll ask you a question, but you can sort of go wherever you want as your opening remarks. My question is this: the sort of elephant in the room seems to be the lack of political resolution to both the internal and interstate tensions in the region. And you guys struggled with this in the first many years of the war in Iraq and U.S. engagement there, and the Obama administration subsequently struggled with it as well, and we don't seem to have found a way to be that constructive in that. So as you talk a little bit about the Middle East going forward, if you could pay a little attention to what you think is doable from a U.S. perspective in terms of encouraging that kind of the resolution of some of those underlying political issues that seem to be the things that last after you have some military success or whatever.
Sure. Well, let me start by, first of all, thanking you guys for having me here, and also congratulating you on the report. I thought it was an excellent report. I hope that it'll be adopted as policy by the next administration, and we'd be sort of off on a pretty good foot. I agree with the points that Brian made about sort of what we need to be doing in the region. I think it's pretty clear that we're not on the same page right now strategically with these partners. And that's a two-way street, perhaps. I think that there's a lot of our partners in the region who feel as though we haven't been committed, and I think that feeling is right in many ways. I mean, you heard a very strong sense of commitment from General Votel, from the military sort of operational level. You don't always hear that same level of commitment from the sort of top level, from the political, strategic level of our government, and that's noticed. We've focused very heavily on ISIS or ISIL, and you hear that very clearly in General Votel's comments, not very much on Iran, or maybe to the extent we focused on Iran, our allies feel as though it's been the wrong focus. And I think that continues, frankly. And when you heard General Votel say, well, maybe these guys in the Gulf are rogue commanders, maybe Iran can become a positive force, that stuff rubs our allies the wrong way, because we've had long enough now dealing with the Iranians to understand that, well, neither of these things is true. And frankly, our allies in the region have, unlike our allies in Europe and even Asia to a great extent, have not really bought into the liberal order in the world in the way that we want to see them buy into it. And that's an issue in our alliances. It's going to continue to be. Look, I think that we have been sort of strategically adrift in the Middle East for a long time. Post 9/11, obviously, counterterrorism was elevated to the sort of prime place in our strategy. And rather than sort of seeking stability as our number one objective, I think we started to focus a lot more on political reform, economic reform secondarily. And that all sort of came together rightly and wrongly in Iraq and the Iraq War. And I think we saw a pretty clear sort of desire to move away from that by President Obama in 2008, and he did move away from it, but probably too far in the other direction, in the direction of withdrawal, retrenchment, pivot to Asia, whatever you want to sort of characterize it as. And probably we're going to see yet another strategic shift come January, no matter how the election turns out. But even if it's Secretary Clinton, I think that you get a clear sense from her that, as is perhaps reflected in the report here, we need to recommit to some of our traditional allies, to some of our partnerships in the region. What I would like to see us do is to not sort of fall prey to what some call solutionism in the region. The idea that what our strategy should consist of in the Middle East is solve Syria, solve Iraq, solve the peace process. because these problems are not in our hands to solve. That's not a policy option per se, as you guys all know, having worked on this region. And it doesn't really resonate, especially today, with the American people, because they'll say, well, why? Why should we solve these problems? Aren't they the region's problems? And I think, frankly, some of our allies in the region would concur with that. I think, Ambassador Al-Otaiba here has written op-eds about how these are really first and foremost problems for folks in the region, and theirs to solve with support from friends like the United States. And so I think we need to identify what are our interests in the region, what should our objectives be in the region. I think those will start with, as I think General Votel sort of hinted at, let's make sure things don't get worse. Let's make sure this instability doesn't spread to new regions. Let's shore up our allies who have been steadfast and who want to sort of help us address, or let us help them perhaps address some of these problems, and so forth. And so that's why I say this report is a good report, because I think it does take us more in that direction of saying, let's not start with solving all the problems. Let's start with what are our interests, what's the right strategy to achieve them. And I think, especially again today in the environment that we're in politically, a big part of that strategy is going to be burden sharing, strengthening these partners, and then pushing more responsibility down into the region itself.
That notion of partnerships, that's runs through this report. It runs through basically the rhetoric of the last 15, 16 years. I want to turn quickly to Linda to talk. The military piece of this is it's necessary but not sufficient, right? It has to, but we have to figure out how to get it right. We have tried about 15 or 20 different ways to build partner forces, irregular forces if it's Syria, the big army if it's Iraq. We've done everything from having distinct commands like we did in the Bush administration to the Obama administration's creation of a counterterrorist partnership fund. And there's a feeling, I think, and it's shared by policymakers and certainly by the public, that none of this stuff actually works. Does it work? Can it work? How could it work in this part of the world?
Thank you. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I too want to commend you for a terrific report. And I think that is just the top line message here, that you need a strategic framework, not to be overambitious, but a sequential, pragmatic, but long-term view. And I think that's really part of the answer to your question, because I think we have moved in some good directions in the operational approach, but unless it's tied into a strategic framework, and I'll mention a couple different elements that I think links the work that I've done primarily on the military, but also this critical question of what next, what then, because we can't just look at the Band-Aids or whack-a-mole or military-only solutions and expect to get, as Secretary Carter has said, lasting defeat. It just doesn't work. Now, you may say there's no lasting defeat to the conflicts in the region, and then you are, I think, into a realm of perpetual war. But I think that the goal of long-term global security requires Middle East stability. So I guess I want to put myself perhaps slightly more on the side of those aspirational thinkers. What has changed really so much in these last 15 years is, as you all know, is the focus on using U.S. military forces in very large numbers, 100,000 plus troops out on the ground, taking the fight to the enemy and then staying around. So clear, hold, and build. That was the mantra during the counterinsurgency era. And I start with that because I think it's very important to note how dramatically we've changed. We've been really trying the small footprint approach, but I think it's more appropriate to say scalable approach, because going too small and being incremental is one of the findings from our April report looking at the first 18 months of the counter-ISIL campaign, is that you're not getting enough bang for your buck if you go too small. But the point is, it's a partnered model by, with, and through, which is a special forces mantra, but it's kind of being adopted now as the way in which the U.S. would like to approach the military aspect of the security problems in the world. And I think it's important to note that the enablers are critical, and it's not just special operations forces who are often out there doing the tactical and operational level advise and assist, but air power has had an important role, and then the linkage between air and ground. And we have some recent work on this, because I think we've learned very much some of that refinement of some tactics that are very critical. Because going back to the Vietnam War, I mean, this was an effort of how do you have the ground forces do the work in those countries with the U.S. assisting. The non-state element, I think, is very important. We have had many non-state partners. We have got a lot of lessons, I think, still to extract from that experience. And I would say the specific issue, of course, that's occurring with the current problem, as was noted by some of the questions earlier, using Syrian Kurds has been somewhat problematic for the strategic effects, the counterproductive effects that that's having in terms of bringing Syrian Arabs in and complication with Turkey. So you need to apply these tactical and operational approaches fully, I think, in view of the political and strategic level. And then, as you said, we have a problem, I think, right now with people saying, great, we've got this partner model working on the military side, and I'm quite concerned that with the foreseen departure of the Islamic State from Mosul, and then likely later Raqqa, people will think we're at the end point. And of course, you do not get a lasting success here with that approach. There has to be stabilization activity. No one likes to use that word anymore. CENTCOM actually uses the word normalization. But the point is stabilization and then political solutions. That's not our solutionism, but I think everyone realizes the region has to work toward some, even if they're temporary or de facto, localized solutions, and eventually probably a more decentralized and legitimate governance model. That's probably enough to say, but I want to also note, while we've been building ground forces, we've lagged on police, and policing has been our Achilles heel throughout this, and we have to take that seriously. And is it the military doing it? Is our Italian friends with the Carabinieri and the Australians with their national police? Do we use our allied partners, which is another piece of this model? Everything, I think we've really refined our partnership with coalition and allies to a pretty high degree. I would like to have one kind of note of caution with this idea of the Middle East Stabilization Force, just because it may work and be very useful with regard to, let's say, Libya as a rollout, if there's a deal struck about Hiftar. But I think you have to be very careful what the region thinks about an Egyptian-led force. And I think the conditionality issue comes into play here. And I salute you for using leverage in your title, because I think a sophisticated approach to leverage, and as you say, behind closed doors, is just a critical part of reassuring and relying on partners. Thanks. Thank you.
So leverage is a perfect place for me to turn to Derek. So Derek, when we look, it's almost impossible to get just how complicated this situation is and put it on paper. You look, the New York Times today tried, it laid out very clearly just all the actors and all the different positions, and how everybody's basically got aims that overlap in some areas and don't in other areas. Go wherever you want on the report and the region, but if you could just take a little time to focus on some of the key outside actors, in particular Russia and the role it's chosen to take since intervening in Syria on behalf of Assad, and Turkey, where we have probably had the most complicated period in U.S.-Turkish relations in recent memory, and how that plays out in the fight primarily for Syria.
Okay, well, thanks, Vikram, and really thanks to Brian and the CAP Middle East team. There has been no shortage of learned studies over the past several years on what to do about the Middle East, and I think this is one of the best ones I've read. I found myself the other night as I was reading it to prepare for this, nodding vigorously quite a bit. And that it's true for both the criticisms, implicit criticisms, but also the way forward, and I commend you both for the analytical power of the report, but also the pragmatic, solution-oriented perspective that you took. So I really commend it to all of you here. Let me try to get at this in a couple ways, and I'll get to Russia and Turkey. I think one point on trying to get us out of the crisis management frame when it comes to the Middle East. I think any of us with experience in government would say amen to that. However, it's really hard to do. And it's partly that's because of the crisis of the region, which seems to get even more complex with each day. And part of that is us, the United States, in the sense of our concerns, legitimate concerns about risks to our personnel, to whether they're military or civilian personnel. I think certainly post-Benghazi, within the Obama administration, there was a sense that we needed to be fully prepared for any contingency as insecurity was emanating throughout the region, and that set an op-tempo for those of us in government who very much wanted to spend time on the big strategic issues, on questions of how quickly can we get the Marines in to protect Embassy X that could be coming under threat at any moment. So, I think there's a sense of enduring crisis in the region, some risk, but part of it's sort of our political ecosystem writ large and willingness, if we want to operate in these dangerous places, and I think we should, and it's in our interest to, there's going to be a degree of risk associated with that. Libya is a perfect example, where we don't even have an embassy today because of the degree of risk on the ground. It makes it very hard for the United States to do anything positive, anything that requires leverage, anything that's about building a strong partner, if you're unwilling to even have an embassy on the ground. So that's thing one on the desire to get out of the crisis management mode, but I'm bumping up against the reality of whether that's possible. Secondly, on partnerships, obviously a big effort of this administration has been to build strong partners. Certainly that was something the Bush administration did as well. Learned a lot of hard lessons along the way, as Lyndon knows better than anyone here, about how difficult that can be. Several constraints. There's the element of time that, as General Votel said, it's going to take a while. We got to stick with it. It's not glorious work where there's a big payoff immediately, but often we're very impatient, even though we don't want to be, what was the solutionism? Our debate here, the way we judge whether things are succeeding or failing, is still rooted in solutionism. Are we seeing progress now in the moment? Can we measure it? Whereas particularly on the question of building strong partners in a part of the world where there's so many challenges, it's going to take a long time. Second, we have diverging interests. And so it's sort of partnership to what end in some ways. And certainly one of the underlying dynamics of this two-way distrust that has settled in, or the concerns that some of our longtime partners have in the region about U.S. interests, are the way our strategic outlooks are diverging, whether it's globally or whether it's particularly in the region in terms of what we're prioritizing. Some of it are things that are just endemic to geopolitical shifts, for example, increasing U.S. energy independence, which I think we all support. Certainly CAP has been a champion of, but that changes the geostrategic picture in the region in terms of expectations about us. If you look at it from a military perspective, the U.S. has got more military capability in theater than we did before 9/11, and that's not even including what we've got there because of ISIS. Massive efforts to support our partners in the region in terms of military capabilities, and to try to develop greater muscle tissue, both within the GCC, for example, and between the GCC and us. So it's not a question to me of retrenchment or withdrawal. I would argue we're more engaged in more places and more ways today than we were a decade ago. A big difference is we have some policy differences over prioritization of interests. We don't have 150,000 troops in Iraq. And we've got a piece of geography, Iraq and Syria, that have been troubling for the last 2 years, the last 10 years, and arguably the last 15 years. And what's interesting in terms of our overall debate, and this gets to the question of what role we should think about of the Middle East as playing in our larger strategic debate, the last two presidents' foreign policies, whether we agree if this is fair or not, have been defined largely by what's happened in the Middle East, and specifically what's happened in Iraq and now Syria. And so just looking forward, is that the way we want to define success for the next president, whoever he or she may be? So there's also then the question finally on the partnership side of resources. And this gets to the patience issue, which is we, despite the tremendous capabilities that our military brings to bear on some of these partnerships, the military is increasingly stretched, not just within the region, but as we think about these partnership efforts around the world, whether it's in Asia Pacific or increasingly in Europe or countries like Ukraine, that we weren't thinking much about building a strong Ukrainian military 4 years ago, and that's a big project for the United States government today. And it's also, as you pointed out, Linda, it's not just a military problem, and we still are dealing with a world in which we under-resource the parts of our government that their capabilities are going to be very important when it comes to building strong police or border guards, for example, in some of these places. Now, finally, on Russia and Turkey, I'm with Brian in that Russia has shown that is willing, in the Middle East, willing to take great risk to protect what it has. But I don't see this as a really successful strategy for building its influence in the region. I understand that some of our partners do want to hedge because they're uncertain about our future, whether we're going to rebalance fully to Asia or we're going to become more isolationist as a country or what have you. So they're kind of open to ideas, but our partners in the region still consider the United States their security partner of first resort, and they want to keep it that way. And that is one of the effects of the concerns about our future in the region, is there's hedging behavior that has created, undoubtedly. But Russia has shown that it is willing to be a spoiler, much worse than that. It's willing to be an arsonist in making the problems of the region, for our interests, but for the people of the region, much, much worse. And Turkey, Turkey is been a indispensable partner of ours when it comes to dealing with the problems of the region, but it also has been a unique challenge for the United States, no question about it. And some of the toughest conversations we've had with our Turkish colleagues over the last several years has been about both what we can do together in Syria, but also concerns about what Turkey may be doing inside Syria in terms of, particularly when it came to the supporting elements of the Syrian opposition. And Turkey is going through its own internal drama right now that is related to what's happening in the Middle East, but it's much more endemic to what's happening inside of Turkey. That will present challenges for the United States in terms of that relationship with a NATO ally that we rely on quite a bit for our own security interests, but that domestically is taking some steps in a direction that we find very concerning.
Thanks, Derek. I want to turn to something Brian said and ask all of you about two things in particular, or any other aspects that you'd be interested in going into. Brian said he thought about calling this Silver Linings Playbook, and there's an emphasis in the beginning of the report saying there's actually stuff going on in the Middle East that has the potential for good things to happen. That includes nascent reforms from Saudi Arabia to UAE to many other countries. That includes, youthful population that could be a problem or could be a potential value. And you talk about things like an Arab Reconstruction Bank, like a Arab Response Force, stabilization force, things that would be sort of the region marshaling its collective resources to do things together. So what do you guys all see as the areas of potential opportunity that can be grabbed onto that might really go somewhere if they get a boost from other allies, from the United States, from other countries in the region? And I'm not going to start with you, Brian. I'm going to start that side and go down, and just sort of the opportunities angle.
Sure. Maybe I'd point to four things. The first is, look, as I mentioned, and as Brian notes, I think, in the report, this is an area of the world where we have seen a lot of, frankly, economic stagnation in the post-war period. What that means, though, is that there's tremendous potential if only there could be structural economic reform and the right policies pursued. Remember, this is an area of the world where, it has a sort of glorious history. It has, at different times throughout world history, been the sort of leading area of the world in terms of culture, economics, politics, and so forth. And I think that there's a lot of potential there in the populations of places like Egypt, in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere that remain to be unlocked, right? Second, I think that we should give ourselves and our partners some credit, because one thing that we have done patiently in the long term is this sort of idea of building up partners like the UAE, like Jordan, like Israel. We tend to think of Israel, for example, which isn't really necessarily part of the discussion in a central way, as a sort of top-rate military power, but they weren't that way several decades ago, and that's as a result of patient bipartisan work that's been done that I think most of us have supported in one way or another. And you see that not just in Israel, but also elsewhere. And that gives us some new options. It gives us the option of doing something like a Middle East stabilization force. Whether you do it or not, the option's there because of that long-term work. Third, I think we see a new willingness among some of these countries to work multilaterally together. And we haven't always appreciated the results of that. It's sparked some criticism from the U.S. government, but there's no doubt that, whereas when I was working on these issues in the Bush administration, we had a very hard time convincing our allies to work together. And now they're doing it sort of despite us sometimes. And that's, I think, actually an opportunity. There's a silver lining, you might say. And then fourth, some of the issues, some of the conflicts that in previous decades we would have said are the sort of biggest threats have subsided. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, for example, someone pointed to, I don't think it's totally subsided. I worry that a conflagration in Gaza, for example, could once again divert a lot of the world's attention, a lot of our attention, if we don't take active steps to head it off. But the fact is, this is no longer the issue that's going to drag the whole region into war. In fact, the status quo is probably comfortable for a lot of countries in the region, which is perhaps why you haven't seen more progress and why it's so hard to make progress on this issue, because there isn't a lot of motivation to do that. Again, there's a sense of opportunity there because you do now see these efforts behind the scenes between Israel and the Arab states to work together. These are tough opportunities to take advantage of, I think, and it'll require a lot of wisdom on the part of the next administration, but they're there.
Linda, what do you think?
Well, I would like to say I think the report's idea of focusing on the GCC and expanding it is a terrific idea, because then you're really putting emphasis on a multilateral kind of approach and trying to knit these countries together in the region so far as you can. And I think to that end, prioritizing the missile defense program will also help repair some of this perception about abandoning those countries to favor Iran, to kind of put it crudely, and also assert vis-a-vis this nascent competition with Russia. Because I do think, granted everything that's been said about Russia, it's unfortunately coming away looking like a clear win on Syria. So I think there's going to be some fallout to deal with there. And then finally, I'd like to say the soft cooperation, again, going from bilateral to a more multilateral approach. And I didn't perhaps directly answer your question of does partnering work or not. And I think there's been certainly a great dismay about how much money was spent on the Iraqi forces in particular, only to see them disintegrate. But what the soft folks that I spend a lot of time with are quick to say is the Iraqi counterterrorism force never disintegrated. It's been in the forefront of every single battle. There is a model that's used, and it's not magic. It's just instead of staying back on bases and doing training and equipping, they're actually out there in an operational advise and assist mode. And that is a fungible model and a scalable model. And it's worked with ANISOC in Afghanistan. The Afghan SOF, again, has been one of the hardier elements there. In the Philippines, what has been done there, Colombia. So I would argue, and obviously it takes a modicum of will by the host country to do some of the things they need to do. But I think it would be wrong, and it certainly requires leadership, developing leadership within that force. I would say that's probably the single most important factor in keeping a force from disintegrating. So I think that I at least, the work that I've done gives me reason to believe that there is a model and a way to achieve its success. So I would build on that.
Eric, opportunities?
So I agree with a lot with what's been said. And I too, in the report, particularly the Reconstruction Bank and the Stabilization Force, although maybe reach goals, I found them interesting to think about as reach goals and making a real effort to try to get there, over the next several decades. I think continuing to develop this architecture of cooperation that has slowly evolved over the last several years in the region, particularly between the U.S. and the GCC. There was a logic to this starting, with baby steps, with sort of ministerial type meetings between whether foreign ministers or the defense ministers that then laddered up to the Camp David process, and we've had 2 of these summits now. I would hope the next president in the first part of next year would do another US-GCC summit. to me, it fills an important gap. If you think of the interactions that U.S. leaders, U.S. presidents have with our European allies and with our Asian allies, there are regularized leader-level interactions. I'm not trying to pretend that meetings are the solution to all these problems, but if you think about that over time and as that plays out and the work that those meetings produce, that 10 years from now could look like a much different regional cooperative security picture than what we've got today. The second issue I'd like to point out that, Brian mentioned Madrid, which made me think of this, and I don't really know how this plays out, but it's something I think that's worth testing, is the potentials of this strategic realignment we've seen in the region, particularly between Israel and some of the Arab partners. And whether it's on Iran or Syria, there's a strategic realignment that's very interesting. And some of those fissures, which were the deepest fissures in the Middle East a decade ago, are becoming shallower. And this may be an instance where the U.S. role is to not play a role. This may be an instance in which the U.S. has a facilitating role that we could help play here, but I think that's something that's at least worth testing with a new team.
And if I could just say on that and then open it up, is that I actually think there needs to be some sort of event, some sort of pivot point, whether it is the military defeat of ISIL in its core center, that focuses the mind in the way that I think the Gulf War in '91 really enabled the Bush administration, H.W. Bush, to sort of go out and then push towards something more positive. The second thing, and I don't think it's a silver lining, but it's something that we've worked on quite a lot, is Egypt. It's certainly not in silver lining space right now when you look at the security or economic landscape. But it has a lot of problems, and we've spent a lot of time on this issue here at the center. But I do think it's an issue that the U.S. needs to invest a little bit more in trying to shape and engage it a lot more, because it doesn't suffer from those sort of problems that we've seen in Iraq or certainly Syria or other places. It's got a different set of problems, which I think are deeply troubling: the human rights record, the crackdown on civil society. But there is a cohesiveness there. And then secondly, in terms of expanding from the GCC to partners in the region, there's a lot of nuance there. That if 2 years ago, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, or Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Kuwait were offering sort of blank checks to Egypt right now, there's much more skepticism and some, I think, tactical fissures between this alliance. And I think the U.S., in a sense, can actually help serve as a bridge because I think these countries that have invested a lot in Egypt don't see the return on investment. And again, I think Egypt has become a problematic partner, but I think it's one where it's not a silver lining yet, but if the Egyptians adopt a different attitude, if a new administration tries to engage it, it's not a raging, flaming meltdown case like some of the other situations in the Middle East.
Let's open it up to questions. Please just say who you are and keep it brief. We'll get as many in as we can. Hallie.
Hi, I'm Holly Tusi with Politico. Thank you guys for doing this today. You touched on this a little bit, Brian. You mentioned this kind of concept of religious tolerance, like this idea of Christians and others in the region. And I was wondering if you could go a little bit more into that. When you talk to people over there about this issue of tolerating other religions, and not just other religions, but non-believers, people who are not in the book, because there's a lot of those in the world.
Yeah.
Is this a message that's getting through? Because it seems like it's the type of thing that, in the very, very long run, is important to having stable societies there. Or is it something that just is not a high priority and they don't care?
I think it's getting through in certain partners in the region, like Jordan and Morocco, the UAE, some parts of Egypt, other places. And what we try to highlight in the report is when you look at sort of the broad brush and the demographic change, and what I think is a silver lining is that there's a certain attitude among the current generation that has lived with ISIL and Al-Qaeda and others. There's a certain, I think, attitude against that, that's out there. And what I think is unfortunate about the authoritarian crackdowns that we see in certain countries is that you need to have space for those sorts of ideas to flourish. So I think institutionally, you look at the case of Jordan recently, and the New York Times, I think, reported on it, of reforming their textbooks. And there's a pushback in the society among some of the more Islamist elements. And it's a tough societal debate. But the main point is that debate needs to be had. I don't think the U.S. can change that for a moment. I think some of the lessons when we were reflecting on this, we learned from the Bush Freedom Agenda, or some of the things I worked on even in the 1990s when I was on the ground. You have to be humble about our abilities to shape it. But I think the last couple of years, and this is a constructive criticism, is that we don't really have, to use Derek's title from his book, a long game on sort of those, what people call soft power or other issues. And it actually matters quite a lot. It matters to particular communities. We've done research on Christians in the Middle East, not because, from a framework of pluralism, that the fabric of these societies and live and let live, it doesn't seem like it's readily available in many parts of the Middle East. But there are these glimmers at the elite levels in places like Morocco and Jordan. There's some changes perhaps in places like Saudi Arabia with some of the new generation trying to temper what the religious establishment is. But if you think we've got complicated politics in this country and, you know, radical extremism and things like that, it's a delicate balancing act. But our main point we're trying to stress in the report is keep it on the agenda. I think one of the unfortunate, and people don't like this criticism sometimes, is the framework for Muslim world engagement that the Obama administration used, I think is incomplete. It actually in some ways is detrimental to what the sort of values that we want to espouse in societies that actually don't see themselves, large pockets of it, as simply just Muslim. You know, they're informed by Islam and the culture and tradition. But given who we are, I think our engagement should be broader, and it should have more of a focus on pluralism and respect for individuals. And I think you start where it's better, in those places where there's more space. You start where there's opportunity to have that debate. But going back to the constructive criticism, I don't think the last few years we've really had a serious long game in that.
In the front.
Thank you. I'm Ali Dad Mafi Nezam with the West Asia Council. My question has to do with the U.S.-Iranian relationship and how the traditional U.S. Middle Eastern allies see some possible openings in that, further openings in that relationship in the years ahead. And the question is, in what sense would the UAE or Saudi Arabia or Israel see their own security being undermined by an opening to Iran? Because it would seem to me that if there is that possibility for that opening, their respective security situation would actually improve, because Iran often sees the U.S. as the threat, not, say, the UAE or even Israel. It sees the U.S. as the country that it has to contend with. And so I'd like to ask you how that situation might be reversed conceptually. Thank you.
Let me ask both Mike and Derek to take a stab at that.
You know, look, when we talk about a U.S. opening to Iran, I'm not always sure what it is we mean, because the U.S. is open. I've always felt this. I think that we've tried many times since 1979 to engage with the Iranians, not just under President Obama, but under every president since Jimmy Carter. And I have always believed, and I firmly believe, that the Americans don't feel we have anything to fear from engagement with either sort of hostile powers or non-hostile powers, or at least that's the way we should feel. I think, though, that what our allies, who themselves pragmatically engage with the Iranians because they have to — Iran's a big neighbor, which isn't going anywhere. It's going to be there for forever. I think they are perplexed as to why we don't, again, see the Iranians clearly. Iran, in this manifestation, is a revisionist power. And the Iranians are absolutely clear about this. All you need to do is read the Iranian media every day, listen to the pronouncements of Iranian officials every day. And I think they would like to see us respond to Iran accordingly, to counter the Iranian threat they see in places like Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Lebanon, and elsewhere. Instead, I think they feel as though they get happy talk from the United States often, and inaction. And ultimately, because they see this as their number one threat, I think they're determined to take action sort of with or without us. I think we would much rather they take action with us. And so that's part of getting on the same page strategically, is identify common threats and then decide what are we going to do about them. And I expect, frankly, that that's what the next administration will try to do as, if not the first order of business, one of the first orders of business, as the next president goes out to the region and talks to those partners. That doesn't mean rip up the nuclear deal. It doesn't mean go to war with Iran. It just means see this problem clearly Sun Tzu said, well, what's the sort of beginning of sort of smart policy? It's know yourself and know your adversaries, right? And I think that's what we need to do in this region, in addition to the other regions of the world.
So I agree with a lot of that. I don't think there's an opening to Iran on the horizon anytime soon. I also don't think the current administration, although it's often criticized as having kind of some delusion about the potential of a relationship with Iran, that was not my experience in the administration. There was great awareness of what Iran does in the region and how it works every day to undermine our interests in the region. So the question is, the word I think in the report is calibration, recalibration. So it's kind of how you calibrate what you're doing, right? And there will be a discussion, I'm sure, by the next president about how we calibrate where we push back against Iran, particularly militarily, when it's doing all sorts of things in the region, whether it's proliferation or funding groups that are seeking to undermine governments that we work with, or fomenting civil wars, where we push back. There's a practical issue, though, that I do think has sort of changed some of the dynamic in the region with our relationships, is that we do talk to Iran now. I mean, I vividly remember in the early part of the Obama administration sitting in meetings in the White House Situation Room where we would sit around and debate endlessly, if the Secretary of State found herself in the room with the Iranian foreign minister in a large multilateral gathering, would they be able to look at each other? And now we're in a situation where the Secretary of State routinely, when it's on a particular issue like the Iran nuclear deal, engages with his counterpart. And that I understand that is unsettling to many partners in the region who became accustomed to a United States that, whether intended to or not, did not engage with the Iranian regime in any way on really any issue. Now, I don't know where that goes in the next administration in terms of that level of interaction. It seems to me when it comes to implementing the nuclear deal, there'll be some interaction, but does that expand out to some of these other areas of concern that in the service of getting the nuclear deal, we decidedly did not talk about other issues on the agenda. We tried to isolate the nuclear issue itself to some controversy. But now how we handle these other issues with the Iranians is something that I'll be watching very closely. And I understand that one of the knockoff effects of that will be greater uncertainty and stress in the region about us and what our intentions are with the Iranians.
I just want to just make one brief response to this, which is I think we do have a fundamental disagreement in that I think the idea that it just is a matter of calibration is just dead wrong. I think that our allies see a fundamental disconnect. And I think there is a fundamental disconnect because I think that prior to the Obama administration, the nuclear issue was seen as sort of a subset of a broader threat that was posed by Iran, again, as a revisionist power. In the same way we look at, say, Russia or China, not as sort of an unalloyed enemy, but sort of as this sort of a broad set of threats together. And I think the situation seems to me to have reversed itself, where then we see sort of Iran as a subset of non-proliferation policy. And you may disagree, but if you look at how the JCPOA is being carried out, it sure looks like all those other concerns are subordinated to implementation of JCPOA. And I would say that what the next administration needs to do is stop seeing Iran policy through the lens of the JCPOA and see the JCPOA through the lens of Iran policy, sort of get it back in the right order in a sense.
Take two more. So way in the back, young woman on the right, and then gentleman in the white with the tie up here.
Hi, Lily Imamian from FTI Consulting. My question is regarding energy, which was mentioned earlier on in the discussion. And specifically, what are the implications of discoveries of natural gas in Israel and the Mediterranean for relationships between countries in the region and U.S. relationships with countries in the region?
Great, and we'll take this one as well, and then we'll do a round the table.
Thank you. Mohammed Ghanem, Syrian American Council. I have a question for Mr. Katoulis. Congratulations on the report. I'm looking forward to reading it tonight. But browsing it quickly, the following recommendation caught my eye, and I have a question about it. It's under set, limited, and achievable objectives, Iraq, Libya, and Syria. It says we should focus on, quote, durable ceasefires and clear lines of control in Syria.
Yeah.
Does that mean partitioning Syria? What do you mean by clear lines of control in Syria? And if that's the case, do you think that partitioning Syria could help in the fight against ISIS and stability in Syria and the region writ large? Thank you.
Hold that thought. I'm going to go left to right, and then we'll just wrap it up. So, any final thoughts, including on energy or Syria or in general? Mike.
Okay, well, so energy. Look, my answer to what are the implications of natural gas finds in the Eastern Mediterranean are that this is generally a good thing, generally a positive thing for relations in the region, because it always helps in diplomatic relations. Well, I shouldn't say it always helps, but it often helps when there's a common interest, when you have something I need, and therefore there's a sort of real impetus to deal with one another. And we see this in some of the talks which have been taking place between Israel and Jordan, Israel and Turkey, and so forth, as long as obviously those rivalries over resources don't erupt into war, which there's no sign that they're going to. The other, though, side of this is what Derek said, which is what are the implications of our sort of energy self-sufficiency for the way that we look at the Middle East and for our sort of global sort of foreign policy balance, as it were. I would sure hope that we don't sort of take energy self-sufficiency to mean we can now safely ignore the region, whether it's because of our allies' energy dependency, energy import dependency in Asia, for example, whether it's because of the fact that energy prices are obviously globally determined, not determined just in North Dakota, or the other interests that we have in the region. I think energy is still very important on the list of American interests in this region. Syria, I will largely leave to others here, except my answer to the partitioning question is I'd be very skeptical about sort of partitioning as a solution to Syria, or the idea that we could simply come in and redraw the lines. I just don't think that's a policy option before the United States, and therefore not one that we should be seriously talking about.
Really, I just want to echo those 2 points. What Michael said on energy, I totally agree with. What's interesting, at least, is that despite our increased energy independence and the abundance of energy here in the United States and low prices, we haven't decoupled from the Middle East much. So maybe giving lie to the idea that we're only there because of our energy dependence. That's number one. Number two, when it comes to the partition issue, I'm with you. I think there's a sort of reality that seems to be settling in that Syria, it's for the foreseeable future, does not look like it's going to be governed as the Syria we used to know. But that's different than saying we're for partition. And I'll let Brian speak to what he meant by the clear lines, but it seems to me as a policy matter, it remains a mistake for the United States in Iraq and Syria to push for partition. Now, if that sort of emerges organically, it's something that we may be able to contribute to positively. We did it, for example, in places like the Balkans, with mixed success. I mean, we ended a war, but we have a peace that's not exactly satisfying to those of us who worked on that issue. That said, I think it's a mistake for the U.S. to push it. The last thing I'll leave you with, just in this general topic of thinking about the Middle East, it's related to the solutionism. The other one is Jeff Goldberg's Carly Simon syndrome. It's not all about us, right? But it's also about expectations. And I think for a variety of reasons, there's a sense that new administration is going to come in and things are just going to change dramatically. Whether it's going to be either a massive recalibration or something way beyond recalibration. And I just think that it came up a bit with General Votel, like we need to take a deep breath. A lot of this is not about us. We have important tools, but limited tools to bring about. It's a big world out there with a lot of challenges. And that change, particularly the kind of change that's going to stick, what did Ash call it? The enduring, lasting defeat, ain't going to come instantly. And so there'll be a big buildup for the shift that will occur early next year, but I think we'll quickly settle back into a reality of a region that will present us with tremendous challenges, a lot of complexity, where we're going to have a lot of good we can do, but it's going to take some time to unfold.
Linda, last words?
I will be quick because I know we're out of time, but there's a lot to say about Syria, and it's a painful case, I think, of how you can't ultimately segregate these problems. And we've chosen to say ISIL, let's go after ISIL, we'll worry about the rest later, and then we have the prospect of winning Syria only to see AQ elements, al-Qaeda elements become stronger, and of course the war against the regime will not end. So I think that actually this idea is, are there half measures that can be palliatives? And we're not willing, I think, to have the military, exert the military leverage that we might. That could change, but it's a big, everyone knows this protracted debate. It would require some very significant steps with costs and risk at this stage to do it. And one last thing I'd like to say to the very first question, the whole counter-violent extremism, and I know you've done a lot of work on it, some of my colleagues have, I've shied away from it partly because I think it always devolves to these sort of phony messaging type things. It really should be about the youth, and I think you have made some long-term recommendations in your report to just how do you reach out to the youth that is the majority of this region in the future.
Great. So really quick, Mohammed, great question. No, not partition, what these guys said. And if you look carefully at it, what we're saying, though, is that I think, and Linda mentioned this too, is there are consequences to certain actions we take when we work with subnational actors militarily and other things, and stitching all of this together in some sort of a longer-term plan. Hard to do in a situation like Syria, but certainly I think what we say in the report is that when you look at decentralization around the region, and the impulse to do that, and how do you fit? How do these countries decide how they fit together? I think it's very important. One fact that people forget, and I talk a lot about Egypt these days, but the latest constitution in Egypt actually has a huge decentralization component because they haven't implemented it yet, but it's a key part of the idea that you can't manage things from the center anymore, that in the periphery, and I think it's a practical, but in Syria, I think it would be a disaster for the US to approach it from that standpoint, but what we're trying to say is in each of these conflicts, you are seeing sort of a settling and hopefully some sort of discussion, less about just ceasefires and more about longer-term governance and what makes the most sense for those societies. And then on energy, I mean, I think it was all said, but I think there are these forces of disintegration that we've seen in the region quite a lot. And then what we're trying to say with silver linings a little bit is that there are potential forces for integration. And when you look at Eastern Mediterranean, the fact that you've got gas resources that Israel, Egypt, Jordan, even the Palestinians have been able to have a discussion about, and to do something practical to help with energy crises is a very important thing. Back to my Egypt fixation, that's also a discussion that Israel and Egypt is having right now, and I think it's very important for the long-term needs of those societies. Last thing I'd say, and I know we're in extra innings, but thanks for sticking around. I think we've got a good program here today. We're really lucky to have this panel. On Tuesday next week, we're going to have a panel with the ambassadors from Jordan, UAE, and as I mentioned, Mike Morrell and Sandy Winnefeld, talking about this notion of partnership and what are the lessons learned from the last couple of years that we can apply to the future. So thanks very much.
Yep, and thank you all. Thanks to our panelists. Let's give everybody a round of applause, and thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you. Very good.
All right.
Well, we'll see.